Taehyun Park couldn't believe what he was seeing. The blue hologram flickered above his small metal desk, showing strange symbols that slowly changed into Korean letters. His mouth fell open as he read the message again and again. The Velkari. Empire wanted him at their Queen's big ceremony. Him, not Ambassador Chang from the main Earth station, not Director Yoon with all her fancy medals, just Daehyun Park, a nobody who worked on a tiny space station near Jupiter. "This has to be wrong," he whispered, running his fingers through his black hair. The Velkari ruled 3 whole star systems. They had ships that could travel faster than light and cities that floated in space like giant diamonds. Why would they care about one small human, Hana? He called out, his voice cracking a little. "Come look at this." Hana Kim rolled her chair away from her computer screens. She was the only other Korean person on the station, which made them close friends even though she was 5 years younger. Her short hair bounced as she moved quickly to his desk. "What's got you so excited?" she asked, then saw the glowing message. Her dark eyes went wide. "No way. The Velkari actually sent you an invitation?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Daehyun said. He touched the hologram and it played a soft musical sound. "Look at this fancy thing. It probably costs more than my whole apartment back on Earth." Hana leaned closer to read the alien writing. "Queen's Ascension Ceremony. That's huge, Daehyun. Only the most important people in the galaxy get invited to something like this." "Exactly my point," he said, standing up so fast his chair rolled backward. "I fix communication problems between Earth and some mining colonies. I'm not important. I've never even met an alien face to face." The space station hummed quietly around them. Outside the small window, Jupiter's red spot swirled like a giant eye. Daehyun had been staring at that same view for 3 years, doing the same boring job every day. Now suddenly the most powerful alien empire in known space wanted him at their biggest celebration. "Maybe they made a mistake," Hana suggested. "Wrong Daehyun Park?" "There aren't that many of us working in space," he replied. "And look here." He pointed to a line of text that had just finished translating. "It says representative of human agricultural interests. What does that even mean?" "I don't know anything about farming," Hana laughed. "Remember last year when you grew those tomatoes in the station's greenhouse? You were so proud of them. Those were just hobby plants. 3 tiny tomatoes don't make me an agriculture expert." Daehyun started pacing around the small room. His footsteps echoed on the metal floor. "The Velkari have technology we can't even understand. They can create matter from nothing. They live for thousands of years, and they want to see my tomato growing." "Skills. Maybe that's exactly why they want you," Hana said quietly. Daehyun stopped pacing. "Oh, what do you mean?" "Think about it. Every other human they've met is probably trying to impress them with our best technology, our smartest scientists, our strongest military people. But you're just normal, real." The hologram chimed again, and new text appeared. "Transportation provided. Departure in 72 hours. Formal response required within 24 hours. Daehyun's hand started shaking. 72 hours. In 3 days he could be traveling to another star system, seeing things no human had ever seen before. Or he could stay here, safe on his boring station, fixing the same communication problems. "Every day I don't have fancy clothes for something like this," he said weakly. "So maybe that's the point," Hana replied. "Maybe they're tired of fancy. Maybe they want to meet a real human for once." Daehyun pressed his face against the small window of the Velkari transport ship, and his breath caught in his throat. The sight before him looked like something from a dream that was too beautiful to be real. The Velkari homeworld hung in space like a massive blue pearl, but that wasn't even the most amazing part. Around the planet, hundreds of crystal structures floated freely in the darkness. Each one was bigger than Earth's moon, spinning slowly and catching starlight like giant diamonds. Some were shaped like towers that stretched for miles. Others looked like floating cities with bridges made of pure light connecting them. "First time seeing Velkari architecture?" asked the ship's pilot, a tall, blue-skinned alien with 4 arms, who had been surprisingly friendly during the 3-day journey. "First time seeing anything like this," Daehyun replied, his voice barely a whisper. "How do they float like that? There's no visible support." The pilot made a sound that might have been laughter. Velkari control gravity the way your species controls fire. Very basic for them. As their shuttle got closer, Daehyun could see more details. The crystals weren't just floating randomly. They moved in perfect patterns, like a dance that had been going on for thousands of years. Some rotated around others, creating spinning rings of light. Others pulsed with colors that shifted from deep purple to bright gold. That's the ceremonial platform, the pilot said, pointing to the largest crystal structure. It looked like a massive flower made of ice and starlight, with petals that opened and closed slowly. Very important place, only used for the most special events. Daehyun's stomach dropped as their shuttle headed straight for it. Through the transparent walls, he could see other ships arriving. Some were sleek and silver, others looked like they were made from living metal that moved and changed shape. One ship appeared to be nothing but a ball of bright energy that somehow held together. "Who are all these people?" he asked. "Not people, beings, representatives from the most powerful civilizations in known space," the pilot replied. "The Nethri, who are pure thought given form. The Korthak, who replaced their bodies with perfect machines centuries ago. The Vorthani, who exist in multiple dimensions at once." Each name made Daehyun feel smaller. What was he doing here among such incredible beings? He looked down at his simple black diplomatic uniform. It was the nicest thing he owned, but compared to what he was about to face, it felt like wearing pajamas to a royal wedding. The shuttle docked with a soft bump, and the pilot turned to him. "Good luck, human. Try not to look too surprised by what you see." The airlock opened, and Daehyun stepped onto the ceremonial platform. The floor beneath his feet looked like solid starlight, somehow warm and solid, but also glowing with its own inner fire. The air smelled like flowers and rain, even though they were in the middle of space. And then he saw the other guests. The Nethri delegation was arriving just ahead of him. At first he thought he was looking at a cloud of silver smoke. But then the smoke began to take shape, forming tall, graceful figures that looked almost human, but seemed to be made of living mist. Their faces changed constantly, showing different expressions like thoughts becoming visible. To his left, the Korthak ambassadors moved in perfect formation. Their bodies were works of art, each one different but clearly designed for maximum efficiency. One had 6 arms, each ending in different tools. Another moved on legs that looked like flowing liquid metal. Their eyes glowed with soft blue light, and when they turned to look at him, Daehyun felt like they were seeing through him, analyzing every detail. A Vorthani representative walked past, and Daehyun's eyes couldn't quite focus on it. The being seemed to be in several places at once, like looking at someone through broken glass. It left a trail of what looked like broken rainbows in the air. Daehyun touched the collar of his simple uniform and tried to stand straighter. Everyone here belonged to civilizations that had mastered space travel when humans were still learning to make fire. They had technologies that seemed like magic, knowledge that spanned millions of years, power that could reshape planets. And here he was, a guy who grew tomatoes as a hobby. The ceremony hall was unlike anything Daehyun had ever imagined. The walls curved upward into infinity, made of crystal that showed swirling galaxies instead of reflections. As dawn broke over the Velkari homeworld, light poured through the transparent ceiling in colors that didn't exist on Earth. Purple mixed, with silver gold blended into shades of blue that made his eyes water. Hundreds of beings from across the galaxy filled the massive space. Some floated in the air, others stood on platforms that adjusted to their different body types. The sound of 1,000 different languages created a low hum that seemed to vibrate through Daehyun's bones. At the center of it all sat the Velkari queen on a throne that looked like it was carved from a single massive diamond. But as Daehyun watched, he realized she wasn't sitting on it at all. She was floating just above it, and her body seemed to be made of pure light that shifted between white and gold. When she moved, tiny stars flickered around her like fireflies. "The gift ceremony will now begin," announced a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Each delegation will present their offering to honor the Queen's ascension." Daehyun's hands were sweating as he clutched the small clay pot his grandmother had made years ago. Inside were seeds from her garden back on Earth, the same ones she had given him when he left for his job in space. "For when you want to remember," "Home," she had said. The first delegation stepped forward. The Nethri representative held what looked like a crystal the size of a basketball, but it pulsed with its own inner light. When the being spoke, its voice sounded like wind chimes. "We offer the memory crystal of 1,000 worlds. Within it are stored the experiences, knowledge, and wisdom of civilizations that have risen and fallen across the galaxy. Every joy, every discovery, every moment of beauty is preserved here for eternity." The Queen's light grew brighter as she accepted the gift, and Daehyun could swear he saw entire worlds spinning inside the crystal. The assembled crowd made sounds of appreciation that ranged from mechanical clicks to musical notes. Next came the Korthak delegation. Their leader carried a device that hurt to look at directly. It seemed to fold in on itself over and over, like a puzzle made of space and time. "We present the Quantum Future Calculator," the mechanical being announced, its voice like perfectly tuned music. "This device can process all possible outcomes of any event and predict the most likely future. It has calculated the rise and fall of stars, the birth of new species, the moment when entropy will claim the universe itself." The Queen accepted this gift as well, and Daehyun noticed that the device seemed to whisper to her in languages he couldn't understand. The other delegates murmured with what sounded like envy. One by one, each species presented gifts that boggled the mind. The Vorthani offered a shard of crystallized time that held moments of pure eternity. The Zelkari brought a weapon that could split atoms with a thought. The Morphic delegation presented a living sculpture that changed shape based on the viewer's deepest desires. Each gift was more incredible than the last. Each one represented technology and knowledge that humanity couldn't hope to understand for centuries, maybe millennia. And then it was his turn. Daehyun's knees felt weak as he walked toward the throne. The Queen's attention focused on him, and he could feel her ancient wisdom studying him like he was a puzzle to be solved. The clay pot in his hands suddenly felt heavier than a mountain. He stopped at the appropriate distance, as the protocol officer had instructed him, and held up the simple brown pot. It looked pathetic next to the cosmic wonders that had come before it. "From humanity," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I offer seeds from my grandmother's garden. She called them seeds of hope." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. He could sense the other delegates turning to look, their alien minds probably wondering if this was some kind of joke. A few of the mechanical beings made what sounded like confused chirping noises. The Queen floated down from her throne and gently took the pot in her hands of light. For a moment, Daehyun thought he saw something like surprise in her glowing features, but when she looked back at the assembled crowd, her expression was perfectly diplomatic. "We thank humanity for this unique offering," she said gracefully. Daehyun quickly bowed and retreated to the observation area, his face burning with embarrassment. He could hear whispered conversations behind him in a dozen different languages, and he was pretty sure none of them were complimentary. He had just embarrassed his entire species in front of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. After the gift ceremony ended, Daehyun tried to make himself invisible in the back corner of the observation deck. The embarrassment of his simple clay pot still burned in his chest. Around him, the other delegates discussed the upcoming transformation ritual in hushed, respectful tones. The Queen had returned to her diamond throne, but now something was different. Ancient Velkari artifacts, each one older than human civilization, began rising from hidden chambers beneath the crystal floor. They floated in a perfect circle around her, humming with power that made the air itself vibrate. "The ascension begins," whispered a nearby delegate, a being that looked like living crystal. "She will become one with the cosmic force that binds all Velkari together." The Queen's light began to pulse in rhythm with the floating artifacts. The sound they made was beautiful at first, like a choir of angels singing in perfect harmony. The crystal walls of the chamber caught the music and amplified it, creating frequencies that seemed to reach into Daehyun's very soul. But then something changed. One of the artifacts, a black stone covered in symbols that hurt to look at, began pulsing out of rhythm. Its harmonic tone shifted, becoming deeper, darker. The beautiful music turned discordant, like a perfect symphony suddenly interrupted by screaming. The queen's light flickered. For the first time since Daehyun had seen her, she looked uncertain, almost afraid. "Something is wrong," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber despite the growing chaos of sound. "The seal of binding is breaking." The black artifact pulsed faster, and cracks of shadow began spreading across its surface. With each crack, the wrongness in the air grew stronger. Daehyun felt like insects were crawling under his skin. Several of the more sensitive alien delegates stumbled backward, their faces showing pure terror. "Impossible," gasped the Korthak leader, its mechanical voice stuttering with static. The ancient seals were designed to last forever. The queen tried to stop her transformation ritual, but it was too late. The other artifacts were locked in resonance with the corrupted one. Dark energy began pouring from the black stone like smoke, but this wasn't ordinary shadow. It moved with purpose, reaching out with tendrils that seemed to exist in more dimensions than Daehyun's eyes could follow. And then the voice came. It spoke in a language that was old when the first stars were born, words that bypassed Daehyun's ears and went straight into his mind. He couldn't understand the meaning, but he could feel the hunger behind it, the endless appetite for something that made his stomach turn with revulsion. "The Harvester awakens," the queen gasped, her light dimming rapidly. "It has waited so long, feeding on the darkness between the stars." She collapsed, her form of living light suddenly solid and heavy. The moment she hit the crystal floor, chaos erupted throughout the chamber. The shadow entity that emerged from the black artifact was like nothing Daehyun had ever imagined. It wasn't just dark, it was the absence of everything good. Where its tendrils touched the crystal walls, the material didn't just break, it ceased to exist, leaving holes that showed empty void. The entity's hunger was immediate and devastating. It reached out to the nearest delegate, a Nethri being of pure thought, and simply touched it. The silver mist creature let out a sound like screaming wind, and then its form began to fade. Its thoughts, its memories, its very essence was being drained away. "Run!" someone shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber's exits had sealed automatically when the ritual began, a safety feature that was now trapping them all inside with this ancient nightmare. One by one, the most advanced minds in the galaxy began falling. The Korthak, with their perfect logic, tried to calculate a solution, but their mechanical brains overloaded trying to process something that shouldn't exist. The Vorthani attempted to slip into other dimensions, but the entity existed in all of them at once. The Zelkari delegates, masters of energy manipulation, tried to fight back with weapons that could crack planets. Their attacks passed right through the creature, like it was made of nothing at all. Daehyun watched in horror as beings who had seemed like gods just minutes before were reduced to empty shells. The entity fed on intelligence, on complexity, on the very thing that made each species special. The more advanced the mind, the faster it was consumed, and through it all that terrible voice kept speaking, growing stronger with each mind it devoured. Words in the first language, the tongue of things that existed before light, before hope, before life itself had learned to dream. The queen stirred weakly on the crystal floor, her light barely a flicker. It was bound here long ago," she whispered. "Our ancestors trapped it in the ceremonial artifacts, but the binding was meant to be renewed each generation. We forgot. We forgot the warnings." The shadow entity turned its attention toward her, sensing the vast knowledge and power contained in her ancient mind. If it consumed her, Daehyun realized, it would become unstoppable, and he was the only one left standing. Not because he was brave or strong or special, but because somehow, for some reason he couldn't understand, the creature's mental attacks that had devastated the greatest minds in the galaxy barely affected him at all. The thing that had made him feel so small and insignificant might be the only thing that could save them all. Daehyun stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, watching the most brilliant beings in the galaxy collapse one after another. The shadow entity moved through the chamber like a hungry storm, and everywhere it touched, minds that had existed for thousands of years simply stopped. The Nethri delegation had been the first to fall. Their silver mist forms which had seemed so elegant and wise, crumpled like paper in a fire. These beings who could think faster than supercomputers, who could process the thoughts of entire civilizations at once, had their perfect clarity turned against them. The entity fed on their flawless logic, draining them until nothing remained but empty silver dust. Next came the Korthak. Their mechanical bodies, designed for maximum efficiency, began sparking and smoking as their quantum processors tried desperately to understand what was happening. Daehyun watched in horror as their glowing blue eyes flickered and went dark one by one. Their leader, the one who had presented the future calculator, fell to its knees with a sound like breaking glass. "System overload," it whispered in a voice, full of static. "Cannot process, cannot compute, error, error." The Vorthani, who existed in multiple dimensions, tried to escape by shifting into spaces that normal beings couldn't even see. But the ancient entity was older than dimensions, older than the laws of physics themselves. It followed them through realities that had no names, consuming them in places that didn't exist. Within minutes, the ceremony hall that had been filled with the galaxy's greatest minds was now a graveyard of empty shells. The silence was broken only by the entity's whispers, words in the first language that seemed to echo from the beginning of time itself. And somehow, impossibly, Daehyun was still standing. The whispers that had driven advanced civilizations to madness sounded like nothing more than distant wind to him. The mental attacks that had shattered quantum computers and consumed pure thought barely registered in his human brain. He felt dizzy and sick, like he had a bad headache, but his mind was still his own. A weak voice caught his attention. One of the Korthak delegates was still alive, though barely. Its mechanical form was cracked and smoking, but its eyes still held a flicker of blue light. "Why," it gasped, its voice distorted by damaged circuits, "why aren't you affected? Your species is primitive. Your minds are chaotic. You should have been the first to fall." Daehyun looked around at the devastation. The queen lay unconscious near her throne, her light almost completely faded. The floating artifacts were still resonating with dark energy, feeding the entity that grew stronger with each passing moment. And there, in the middle of it all, sat his grandmother's clay pot. Something had changed. The simple brown pot was cracked now, probably from the vibrations of the dark ritual. But through one of the cracks, Daehyun could see something impossible. A tiny green shoot was pushing its way through the soil, reaching toward the chaotic light of the ceremony chamber. One of his grandmother's seeds was growing. Here in the middle of an alien world, surrounded by cosmic horror and ancient evil, life was finding a way. "Maybe," Daehyun said quietly, kneeling beside the pot, "it's because we're still growing." The Korthak's damaged voice processors made a sound like confused static. "Growing? I don't understand." Daehyun touched the tiny green shoot gently. It was warm, and he could swear he felt it pulse with life. "You all became perfect," he said, looking around at the fallen delegates. "The Nethri perfected thought. The Korthak perfected logic. The Vorthani perfected existence itself. But humans, we're still figuring things out." The entity's whispers grew louder, more insistent. It had noticed that one mind in the chamber was still functioning, still thinking thoughts it could consume. But when it reached toward Daehyun, something strange happened. The ancient creature recoiled, like it had touched something hot. The whispers became confused, almost frustrated. Here was a mind it couldn't understand, couldn't process, couldn't drain. Not because it was too strong, but because it was too messy. "Your thoughts are," the Korthak whispered, its voice failing, "chaotic, illogical, full of emotions, dreams, memories that make no sense. How do you function?" Daehyun smiled, still watching the tiny plant grow. "We don't function. We just live. We make mistakes. We feel things that don't make sense. We hope for things we can't have. We dream about impossible futures and remember conversations with people who died years ago." The entity pressed closer, its shadow tendrils reaching for him again. But every time it tried to feed on his thoughts, it found chaos instead of order. Where it expected logic, it found emotion. Where it looked for perfect knowledge, it found questions and doubts and wild guesses. My grandmother used to say that the secret to growing anything was to not think too hard about it, Dae-hyun continued, his voice growing stronger. Just plant the seed, give it what it needs, and let it figure out the rest. She said thinking too much about how plants grow was a good way to kill them. The tiny green shoot pushed higher, its first real leaf unfurling in the strange light of the alien chamber. And for the first time since the entity had awakened, its whispers began to sound less confident, less hungry. It had spent eons feeding on perfection, on the crystalline thoughts of advanced civilizations. But human messiness, human chaos, human stubborn refusal to make sense was something it had never encountered before, and it was choking on it. Dae-hyun watched the shadow entity writhe and twist as it tried to make sense of his chaotic human thoughts. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt something other than terror. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could do something about this, but what could one ordinary human do against an ancient cosmic horror that had just consumed the greatest minds in the galaxy? The answer came to him as he looked at the tiny green shoot pushing through the cracked clay pot. His grandmother had always talked to her plants, not because she thought they could understand her words, but because talking helped her think, helped her care, helped her remember why growing things mattered. "Do you know what's funny?" Dae-hyun said out loud, his voice echoing strangely in the mostly empty chamber. The entity's whispers paused, as if confused by this unexpected development. "My grandmother always said plants grow better when you talk to them." Everyone thought she was crazy, but she didn't care. She'd go out to her garden every morning and tell her tomatoes about her dreams, complain to her roses about the weather, share gossip with her pepper plants. He knelt beside the clay pot and gently touched the soil around the sprouting seed. The entity's shadow tendrils reached toward him again, but when they got close, they seemed to hesitate, almost confused. She used to tell me that plants were like people. They needed more than just water and sunlight. They needed someone to care about them, to notice when they were struggling, to celebrate when they grew. Dae-hyun's voice grew warmer as he remembered. "I thought it was silly back then. I was 16 and knew everything, you know." The ancient whispers grew more agitated. The entity was trying to feed on these memories, but they kept slipping through its grasp like water. There was no complex structure to drain, no perfect logic to consume, just a teenage boy rolling his eyes at his grandmother's strange habits. But the weird thing was, her plants really did grow better than anyone else's. The neighbors would come by and ask for advice, and she'd just shrug and say, "I talked to them." Made no scientific sense whatsoever. Dae-hyun could feel the creature pressing against his mind, trying to find something solid to grab onto. But human memories weren't like the crystalline thoughts of the Nethri or the perfect calculations of the Korthak. They were messy, emotional, full of details that didn't matter, and feelings that made no logical sense. "I remember the smell of her kitchen on Sunday mornings," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "She'd make these pancakes that were never quite round, and the kitchen would smell like vanilla and cinnamon and something else I could never identify. My mom always said she put too much sugar in everything, but nobody complained when they were eating it." The entity recoiled as if burned. These simple, warm memories were like poison to something that fed on complex thought. There was no grand knowledge here, no cosmic understanding, just a human boy remembering his grandmother's imperfect pancakes. And when it rained, oh man, she loved the rain. She'd open all the windows in the house and just listen to it hitting the roof. Said it was nature's way of singing the plants to sleep. My dad would complain about the humidity, but she'd just smile and say, "The garden needs its lullaby." With each memory, the shadow tendrils pulled back further. The ancient whispers became more frantic, more confused. This creature had existed since before civilizations learned to dream, but it had never encountered a mind that worked like this. "She died when I was 22, Dae-hyun said quietly, his hand still protecting the tiny plant. "Cancer. But before she went, she gave me a little bag of seeds from her garden. For when you want to remember home," she said. I thought it was silly. I was living in space stations and working with alien technology. Why would I need seeds? The entity made a sound like screaming wind, frustrated by its inability to consume these chaotic human emotions. It tried a different approach, sending waves of pure terror toward Daehyun, the kind of cosmic fear that had paralyzed entire species. But instead of falling to his knees in terror, Daehyun just smiled sadly. You know what scared me most about losing her? It wasn't death or pain or any of the big things. It was that I'd never again smell those imperfect pancakes or hear her talking to her tomatoes. It was losing all the little ordinary moments that made her who she was. The tiny plant grew another millimeter, its second leaf beginning to unfold, and somewhere in the chamber, one of the fallen delegates stirred slightly, as if Daehyun's words were creating a buffer against the entity's influence. The thing about humans, Daehyun said, looking directly at the writhing shadows, is that we don't make sense. We care about things that don't matter. We remember conversations from 20 years ago and forget where we put our keys 5 minutes ago. We cry at movies and laugh at our own jokes. The entity's whispers became almost pleading, desperate to find some order in this chaos of human experience. And that's exactly why you can't digest us, Daehyun realized, his voice filled with sudden understanding. You feed on perfection, on order, on minds that make sense. But we're beautifully broken. We're still growing, still changing, still figuring out who we are. The ancient creature writhed in frustration, its hunger turning to something that almost looked like pain. And in that moment, Daehyun knew he had found its weakness. As Daehyun continued sharing his grandmother's memories, something incredible began happening around him. The fallen delegates, who had been lying motionless like broken dolls, started to move. First, just tiny movements, a finger twitching here, an eye flickering there. But slowly, impossibly, they were coming back to life. The Korthak delegate, whose circuits had been sparking, managed to lift its head. Its blue optical sensors were dim but functioning. The pressure is lifting, it said in a voice full of static and wonder. Your chaotic thoughts are creating interference. Even more surprising was a familiar voice from behind him. Daehyun, what the hell is going on here? He spun around to see Jinwoo Lee, his cultural attaché from Earth, struggling to sit up near the entrance to the chamber. Jinwoo looked confused and terrified, but very much alive. His dark hair was messy, and his diplomatic uniform was wrinkled, but his eyes were clear and focused. Jinwoo. Daehyun felt a surge of relief so strong it almost knocked him over. You're okay, but how did you get here? I was supposed to be your backup support, remember? Arrived on the last transport. Jinwoo looked around at the chaos in the chamber, the unconscious queen, the writhing shadows. Though I'm starting to think I picked a really bad time to show up. The entity's whispers grew more agitated at the presence of another human mind. It sent out tendrils of shadow toward Jinwoo, but they seemed to slide off his thoughts like water off glass. Keep talking, Jinwoo urged, pulling himself to his feet. Whatever you were doing, it's working. I can feel that thing trying to get into my head, but it's like it can't get a grip. Daehyun nodded and continued, his confidence growing. Jinwoo, remember when we were kids and the power went out during that big storm? Oh man, yes. Jinwoo's face lit up despite their terrifying situation. Your mum made us build a fort out of couch cushions, and we told ghost stories with flashlights. And you were so scared you couldn't sleep, so my dad sat up with us all night teaching us card games. Daehyun smiled at the memory. He cheated the whole time, but we were too young to notice. As they shared this simple childhood memory, more delegates began stirring. The warmth of human friendship, the silly joy of kids being kids, seemed to create a protective bubble around them. The entity's shadows couldn't penetrate memories of couch cushion forts and friendly card games. I don't understand, whispered one of the Nethri beings, its silver form slowly reforming. These thoughts have no structure, no purpose. They're just random moments. That's exactly the point, Jinwoo said, understanding dawning on his face. This thing feeds on complexity, on perfection, but human memories aren't perfect. They're full of mistakes and emotions and stuff that doesn't matter to anyone but us. The queen stirred on her crystal floor, her light flickering weakly back to life. When she tried to speak, her voice was barely a whisper. The ancient texts, They spoke of a species that would be immune to the harvester. We thought it meant a species with perfect mental shields, but it meant the opposite. Daehyun knelt beside the tiny plant growing in his grandmother's pot. It now had 3 small leaves, impossibly green against the chaos around them. "Tell them about your sister's terrible cooking," he said to Jinwoo. "Oh no, not the kimchi incident." Jinwoo laughed despite everything. "Okay, so Minseo thought she could improve our mom's kimchi recipe." She added pineapple. Pineapple! The whole kitchen smelled like a tropical disaster zone. Even some of the alien delegates made sounds that might have been laughter. The absurd image of ruined kimchi was so completely human, so wonderfully pointless, that it created another wave of protection against the entity's influence. "And then," Daehyun added, "she tried to fix it by adding chocolate." "Stop," wheezed the Korthak delegate. "My logic circuits cannot process why anyone would add chocolate to fermented vegetables. The very concept is creating beneficial chaos in my systems." The entity writhed in frustration. Every human story, every pointless memory, every emotional reaction was like static interfering with its ability to feed. These beings thought with their hearts as much as their heads. They remembered not just facts, but feelings, not just events, but the weather on the day those events happened. "Keep going," the Queen urged, her light growing stronger. "Your chaos is healing us." So they did. Daehyun and Jinwoo shared stories of school embarrassments and family dinners, of failed first dates and successful second chances. They talked about the time Daehyun's father tried to fix their car and ended up making it worse, about Jinwoo's mother's obsession with feeding everyone who came to their house, about the stray cat that adopted their whole neighborhood. With each story, more delegates recovered. The Vorthani managed to stabilize in this dimension. The Zelkari's energy forms stopped flickering. Even some of the smaller delegations that Daehyun hadn't noticed before began moving again. But most importantly, the Queen's light was returning, not as the cold perfection of advanced civilization, but warmed by something entirely new. The chaotic, messy, beautiful imperfection of human hope. The entity's whispers became desperate, angry. It had never encountered prey that made it weaker just by being themselves, and in his grandmother's cracked clay pot, the little plant kept growing. The entity was getting desperate now. Daehyun could feel its ancient fury building like a storm, about to break. After feeding on the greatest minds in the galaxy for what felt like hours, it was somehow getting weaker instead of stronger. The chaotic human thoughts that filled the chamber were like poison to its perfectly ordered hunger. With a sound like reality tearing, the creature gathered all its remaining power for one final assault. The shadows exploded outward from the corrupted artifact, reaching for every mind in the chamber at once. This wasn't the careful, selective feeding it had done before. This was pure desperation, an attempt to consume everything and everyone before these strange human thoughts could weaken it further. "It's trying to eat us all at once," Jinwoo shouted, grabbing Daehyun's arm as waves of crushing darkness swept toward them. But something impossible happened. The little plant in Daehyun's grandmother's clay pot, which had grown from a tiny shoot to a small but healthy seedling, suddenly blazed with its own light. Not the cold, perfect radiance of advanced technology, but the warm, green glow of life itself. "What the—" Daehyun stared as the plant's roots, which should have been contained in a few inches of soil, somehow extended beyond the pot. He could see them now, glowing threads of light that reached down through the crystal floor, through the ceremonial platform, through the quantum fabric of space itself. The roots were connecting to something vast and ancient, but not evil-like. The shadow entity. This was the opposite of the harvester's hunger. This was the force that made stars burn, that turned dead rocks into living worlds, that pushed tiny seeds to grow, even in the most impossible places. "Life finds a way," Daehyun whispered, remembering something his grandmother used to say. "No matter how dark it gets, life always finds a way." The plant's roots touched the quantum foundation of reality, and suddenly everything changed. The simple act of growth, of one small seed, refusing to give up in the face of cosmic horror, created a resonance that shook the entire chamber. The entity's shadows hit this resonance and shattered like glass against a mountain. Its ancient whispers became screams of confusion and pain as the very concept of growth, of life persisting against impossible odds, tore through its ordered existence. "No," it hissed in that first tongue that predated civilization. "Impossible. Life should submit. Growth should cease. Order must prevail." But the little plant just kept growing, its leaves reaching toward the chaotic light of the ceremony chamber. And with each moment of growth, the entity's grip on reality weakened further. The other delegates watched in amazement as the shadows began dissolving like smoke in sunlight. The Korthak's logical processors, which had been overloaded by the entity's chaos, suddenly stabilized as they focused on the simple, beautiful mathematics of plant growth. The Nethri found their perfect thoughts healing as they contemplated the messy, wonderful process of life creating itself from nothing. "It's working," breathed the queen, her light growing stronger by the second. "The harvester cannot exist in the presence of active creation. Its nature is to consume, to end, to bring final order. But life is the opposite of ending. The entity made one last desperate attempt to maintain its hold on the dimension. It lashed out at the plant directly, trying to wither it with pure entropy. But the tiny seedling had something the ancient creature had never encountered before. The stubborn, illogical determination that only comes from beings who refuse to make sense. The plant didn't just survive the attack. It grew faster. With a sound like the universe sighing in relief, the entity's form began to collapse, its shadows pulled back into the corrupted artifact, which cracked and crumbled to dust. The ancient whispers faded to nothing, and the oppressive weight that had filled the chamber lifted like a storm passing. The queen rose to her full height, but her light was different now. Instead of the cold, perfect radiance she'd had before, her glow was warmer, more alive. It flickered and danced like candlelight, touched by something beautifully imperfect. "The harvester is gone," she announced, her voice carrying new warmth. "After eons of slumber, it has been destroyed not by superior force or greater knowledge, but by the simple refusal to give up." She looked at Daehyun with what he could only describe as wonder. "We understand now why it could never truly consume. Humanity. You don't think in straight lines. Your thoughts grow like plants, reaching in unexpected directions, finding nourishment in the strangest places." Jinwoo helped Daehyun to his feet, both of them staring at the little plant that had somehow saved the galaxy. It was just a simple seedling with 4 small leaves growing in cracked clay. Nothing special by any objective measure, but it was alive. And sometimes that was enough. "Your species has a gift," the queen continued, addressing both humans. "You carry chaos not as a weakness, but as a strength. You grow not despite difficulties, but because of them." Around the chamber, delegates from dozens of species were getting back to their feet, their advanced minds slowly recovering from the entity's assault. They looked at the 2 ordinary humans with expressions ranging from confusion to respect, to something that might have been awe. Daehyun carefully picked up his grandmother's pot, cradling the little plant that had done the impossible. "She always said her garden grew best when things got difficult," he said softly. "Guess she was right about more than I thought." The ceremony chamber filled with the sound of alien voices, all talking at once in a dozen different languages. But for the first time since he'd arrived, Daehyun wasn't embarrassed to be human. He was proud of it. As the last of the shadow entity's whispers faded into nothing, an uncomfortable silence filled the ceremony chamber. Daehyun stood there holding his grandmother's clay pot, feeling like he'd just woken up from the world's strangest dream. Around him, the most powerful beings in the galaxy were slowly getting back to their feet, but they were all staring at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. The queen's light had stabilized, but it was still different from before. Warmer, somehow less perfect but more alive. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the chamber go completely silent. "There is something you all must know," she said, her gaze moving from delegate to delegate before settling on Daehyun. This ceremony was not what it appeared to be. Daehyun felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "The ascension ceremony was real, yes, but it was also a test, a trap." The queen's light pulsed gently as she continued. 300 years ago, Our deepest scanning revealed the dormant entity sealed within our ancient artifacts. We knew it would eventually awaken, and when it did, no amount of advanced technology or perfect logic would be able to stop it. The key. Assembled delegates began murmuring among themselves in dozens of different languages. The Korthak leader, its circuits still sparking occasionally, stepped forward. "You mean we were all brought here as bait?" "Not bait," the Queen corrected gently. "Volunteers. Every species here knew the risks. Every delegate understood they might not survive. But there was one invitation that was different." She turned, to face Daehyun directly, and he could swear he saw something like a smile in her radiant features. "We had studied humanity for decades, watching your chaotic thought patterns, your emotional decision-making, your stubborn refusal to think in straight lines. Our scientists calculated that only a species with your particular cognitive chaos could resist the Harvester's influence." Jinwoo grabbed Daehyun's arm. "Wait, you're saying they planned this whole thing? They knew he could stop that monster?" "Not knew," the Queen admitted. "Hoped. It was the only plan we had." She gestured to the little plant growing in the cracked pot. "Your grandmother's seeds were not dismissed by our court, young Daehyun. They were recognized as exactly what we needed. Life that grows not through perfection, but through persistence." Daehyun looked down at the tiny seedling. Its fourth leaf was just beginning to unfurl, bright green against the alien crystal of the chamber floor. "But it's just a plant. Just something my grandmother grew in her backyard garden." "Just a plant," repeated the Zelkari delegate, its energy form flickering with what might have been laughter. "This just a plant saved every mind in this chamber. It broke an entity that had consumed civilizations." The Queen floated closer to Daehyun, her warmth making the little plant's leaves seem to glow. "Your species thinks with your hearts as much as your minds. This makes you unpredictable, chaotic, often illogical, but it also makes you impossible to fully understand or consume. The Harvester fed on order, on perfection, on minds that made sense, but human thoughts." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Human thoughts grow like gardens, messy, wild, reaching in directions that defy all logic." A new voice spoke up from the crowd of delegates. It was the Vorthani representative, its multi-dimensional form more stable now. "We have a proposal." The Queen nodded for it to continue. "Earth should be granted full membership in the Galactic Council with a specialized role. When we encounter problems that our logic cannot solve, when our advanced thinking becomes a limitation rather than a strength, we call upon humanity." "What kind of role?" Daehyun asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. See, Queen's light grew brighter, warmer. "Galactic Gardener, you would travel between worlds, bringing your chaotic human perspective to problems that pure logic cannot solve, teaching other species the value of thinking with their hearts, of growing, despite difficulties of finding hope in impossible places." Daehyun looked around the chamber at dozens of alien faces, all watching him with what he was starting to recognize as respect. These beings who had seemed like gods just hours ago were asking him to help them learn how to be more human. "I don't know anything about being a gardener on a galactic scale," he said honestly. "You know everything that matters," the Queen replied. "You know how to care for something small and seemingly insignificant until it becomes strong enough to change the world." Jinwoo nudged him with his elbow. "Come on, man, your grandmother would be so proud." And that decided it. Daehyun carefully adjusted the clay pot in his hands, making sure the little plant was comfortable. "Okay," he said simply, "but I'm going to need a bigger pot." The sound that filled the chamber might have been laughter, or it might have been the music of a dozen different species expressing joy in their own unique ways. But to Daehyun it sounded like applause. As the formal ceremonies began and the paperwork of galactic diplomacy took over, Daehyun found a quiet corner where he could tend to his plant. A few drops of condensation had formed on the crystal walls, and he carefully collected them to water the soil. "The first earth seed to grow in alien soil," he murmured to the little plant, just like his grandmother had talked to her garden. Nourished by the tears of joy from a dozen different species, humanity had finally found its place in the galaxy. Not as the most advanced civilization, not as the strongest or smartest or most sophisticated, but as the most alive. And sometimes, that was the most important thing of all.